In 1944, 85,000 Japanese soldiers marched across the Chindwin River, climbed through mountain jungle, and invaded India. Their commander promised Tokyo a 3-week victory. What he delivered instead was the largest defeat in Japanese military history, a catastrophe so total that the retreat path became known as the Road of Bones. Soldiers dropped dead from starvation along jungle trails, while their own generals turned on each other, and one divisional commander openly refused orders and cut his own communication wires. Over 50,000 Japanese troops were killed, wounded, or went missing in the mountains around a remote Indian town called Imphal. However, while most people can name the beaches of Normandy or the sands of Iwo Jima, almost nobody outside of military history circles has ever heard of the battle that broke the Japanese Empire in Asia. And the reason for that is a story in itself. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to 1942, when the war in Asia looked completely different from how it ended. Japan had been on a rampage. After attacking Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japanese forces tore through Southeast Asia at a speed that stunned the world. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Malaya was overrun. Singapore, the so-called fortress of the British Empire, surrendered in February 1942 in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. Around 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops laid down their weapons that day, and the shock rippled across every corner of the empire. The fall of Singapore was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological earthquake. Over 80,000 troops surrendering to a force that was outnumbered. The myth of European invincibility in Asia shattered overnight. And among the thousands of Indian soldiers taken prisoner at Singapore were the men who would later form the backbone of the Indian National Army. That matters, and we will come back to it. Then it was Burma's turn. The capital Rangoon fell in March 1942, and what followed was the longest retreat in British military history. British, Indian, and Burmese troops stumbled nearly 1,000 miles through jungle and monsoon rains, retreating all the way back across the border into northeastern India. They arrived broken, demoralized, and riddled with malaria and dysentery. The retreat took 5 months, and the columns of refugees and soldiers who staggered into the Indian state of Manipur looked more like survivors of a natural disaster than a functioning army. Among those refugees were thousands of civilians, many of whom never made it at all. By late 1942, the front line had settled along the India-Burma border, and the Japanese controlled virtually everything on the far side of the Chindwin River. The British set up their main forward base at the town of Imphal, the capital of Manipur, a small city sitting on a flat plain, surrounded on every side by steep forested mountains. It was a natural fortress, and the British turned it into a massive supply hub, filling it with airfields, ammunition dumps, fuel depots, and enough rations to feed tens of thousands of soldiers. If you controlled Imphal, you controlled the only practical route between India and Burma. Both sides knew it. Now, this is where one man's obsession changed everything. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi had been a career soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army for decades. He had played a role in starting the war with China back in 1937 at the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and he had helped lead the conquest of Malaya and Singapore. By 1943, Mutaguchi was given command of the Japanese 15th Army in Burma, and from the moment he took the job, he was consumed by a single idea. He wanted to invade India. His plan was called Operation Yugo, and it was bold to the point of recklessness. Mutaguchi intended to send 3 full infantry divisions, roughly 85,000 men, plus an Indian National Army division, across the Chindwin River and through 150 miles of some of the most brutal terrain on Earth. Mountains over 2,000 meters high, covered in dense tropical jungle, crisscrossed by rivers and gorges, all of it soaked by monsoon rain for months out of the year. His forces would march through all of this, capture Imphal, and cut the British off from their supply base. Then, if things went well, he dreamed of pressing on toward the Indian heartland. But there was a problem built into this plan from the start, and Mutaguchi either ignored it or simply did not care. His army could not carry enough food and ammunition for a long campaign. The plan depended on speed. 3 weeks, maybe 4. The Japanese would move fast, overwhelm the British, capture their supply dumps, and live off stolen rations. If that did not happen, if the British held on and the battle dragged out, the Japanese army would starve in the mountains. Mutaguchi's own staff knew this. His intelligence chief warned him the offensive was impossible, and Mutaguchi fired him for it. His 3 divisional commanders all had serious doubts. Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, who commanded the 31st Division, told his officers before the campaign that every one of them should be prepared to die of starvation in the mountains. But Mutaguchi pushed the plan through anyway, using emotional appeals and political maneuvering to win approval from his superiors. And there was one more factor that made the plan attractive to Tokyo. Marching alongside the Japanese would be soldiers of the Indian National Army, led by the charismatic Indian nationalist Subhas Chandra Bose. Bose had formed the Indian National Army from Indian prisoners of war captured by the Japanese at Singapore and recruited from Indian communities across Southeast Asia. His troops marched under the war cry Chalo Delhi, which meant on to Delhi. The idea was that once Japanese and Indian National Army forces crossed into India, the local population would rise up against British colonial rule, and the whole British position in Asia would collapse like a house of cards. That was the theory. What Mutaguchi did not account for was the man waiting for him on the other side of the mountains. Lieutenant General William Slim was the commander of the British 14th Army, and he was nothing like the overconfident British generals the Japanese had humiliated in 1942. Slim was the son of a tradesman from Birmingham, not an aristocrat. He had worked his way up through the ranks the hard way, earning a military cross at Gallipoli in World War I, getting wounded multiple times, and spending decades in the Indian Army. He was modest, practical, and brutally honest about his own mistakes. After the disaster of the 1942 retreat from Burma, Slim had spent nearly 2 years rebuilding the 14th Army from scratch. He retrained his troops in jungle warfare, improved their medical care, boosted morale by making sure they received proper food and supplies, and developed entirely new tactics to counter the Japanese. The old approach had been to retreat whenever the Japanese cut behind you and threatened your supply lines. That is exactly what the Japanese expected the British to do, and it had worked devastatingly in their favor during the fall of Burma and Malaya. Slim told his men to do the exact opposite. Stand and fight. Hold your position, form a defensive box with all-around perimeter security, and let the Royal Air Force resupply you from the air. He had already tested this concept at the Battle of the Admin Box in the Arakan in February 1944. When an encircled Indian division held its ground for weeks and was resupplied entirely by air until reinforcements arrived, it worked. And it shook the Japanese badly, because their entire offensive doctrine depended on the British running away. Turn the Japanese tactic of encirclement against them. Let them exhaust themselves attacking fortified positions while their own supply lines stretched thinner and thinner. This was a completely different kind of British army, and the press back home barely noticed it existed. The newspapers were full of the war in Europe, of the fighting in North Africa and Italy, of the coming invasion of Normandy. The soldiers of the 14th Army called themselves the Forgotten Army because nobody seemed to know or care what they were doing in the jungles of Burma and northeast India. It was a multinational force, drawing soldiers from Britain, India, Nepal, West Africa, and East Africa. Nearly 1 million men by the end of the war, yet it received a fraction of the attention given to the armies fighting in Europe. Slim knew the Japanese were coming. Intelligence reports in early 1944 showed a massive buildup of Japanese forces along the Chindwin River. Rather than march forward to meet them in the dense jungle where the Japanese excelled, Slim made a counterintuitive decision. He pulled his forward divisions back to the Imphal plain. Let them come to us, he reasoned. Make them march 150 miles through the mountains, burn through their supplies before they ever reach us, and then fight them on ground we have chosen. On March 7, 1944, Operation Yugo began. Japanese forces crossed the Chindwin River and plunged into the mountains, moving in 3 separate columns. The 33rd Division advanced from the south toward Imphal. The 15th Division came from the east, and in the north, Sato's 31st Division headed for a small hill station called Kohima, a village perched on a ridge overlooking the only road connecting Imphal to the railroad at Dimapur. If the Japanese took Kohima and cut that road, Imphal would be completely isolated from the rest of India by land. The initial Japanese advance was fast, frighteningly fast. They cut the road south of Imphal within 3 weeks, nearly surrounding the 17th Indian Division at Tidim and forcing a desperate fighting withdrawal. They overran the garrison at Sangshak after brutal hand-to-hand combat. And at Kohima, the situation turned critical almost overnight. On April 3rd, a Japanese force of about 15,000 men slammed into a garrison of roughly 2,500 defenders, many of them non-combat troops, clerks, supply staff, and rear echelon personnel who suddenly found themselves on the front line. What happened at Kohima over the next 2 weeks became one of the most extraordinary last stands in military history. The garrison was pushed back, hill by hill, trench by trench, into a tiny perimeter on Garrison Hill. The fighting centered on the grounds of the British Deputy Commissioner's bungalow, a pleasant colonial residence that had a tennis court in its garden. That tennis court became one of the most savage battlefields of the entire Second World War. Japanese and British soldiers dug trenches on opposite sides of the court, so close that they could throw grenades at each other by hand. The combat was hand-to-hand, fought with bayonets and knives and fists in a space barely wider than a basketball court. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission later called it the scene of perhaps the most bitter fighting of the whole Burma campaign. By April 18th, after 2 weeks of relentless attacks, the defenders of Kohima held only about 350 square meters of ground. The stench of decomposing bodies and excrement was overwhelming. Water supplies had been captured by the Japanese, and the surviving defenders were rationing what little they had left. Then, on that same day, the lead elements of the British 2nd Division broke through the Japanese roadblocks on the Dimapur Road and reached the garrison. The relief force had arrived just in time, but the Battle of Kohima was far from over. The Japanese switched from attacking to defending, clinging to the ridgeline positions they had captured with the same fanatical determination that had characterized their assault. The British 2nd Division fought for another 6 weeks to push them off the ridge, enduring constant mortar fire, sniper attacks, and counter-assaults. The fighting on that single ridge cost the Japanese about 7,000 casualties. Meanwhile, down on the Imphal plain, the siege was grinding on. The Japanese 33rd and 15th Divisions had closed in around the town, cutting most of the roads leading in and out. But Slim's strategy was working. Instead of panicking at being surrounded, the British and Indian troops dug in and fought from fortified positions around the plain, at places like Bishanpur, Shenam Saddle, and Nungshigum Hill. The fighting at these positions was ferocious, with Japanese infantry launching wave after wave of attacks against dug-in defenders, supported by tanks and artillery. And the whole time, the Royal Air Force was keeping Imphal alive from the sky. Hundreds of Dakota transport aircraft flew sortie after sortie over the mountains, threading through cloud banks and monsoon squalls to drop food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies to the besieged garrison. At its peak, the airlift was delivering over 500 tons of supplies per day. The 5th Indian Division was flown in as reinforcement. The entire division airlifted into the Imphal plain during the battle, something that would have been completely impossible just 2 years earlier. Wounded soldiers were evacuated by air in the same planes that brought supplies in. Slim later said that Allied air supply allowed his ground forces to consolidate their positions without being forced to retreat, and it was exactly this capability that made the Japanese encirclement tactics worthless. This was the key to Slim's strategy, and the reason Mutaguchi's plan was doomed from the start. The British could be resupplied by air, the Japanese could not. Every day that the battle continued, the British grew stronger while the Japanese grew weaker. And this is where Mutaguchi's obsession became a death sentence for his own army. Weeks passed, then months, The 3-week victory he had promised was nowhere in sight. The monsoon arrived in full force, turning the mountain trails into rivers of mud. Japanese supply lines, which had been inadequate from the beginning, collapsed entirely. Soldiers who had started the campaign with 3 weeks of rations ran out of food within the first month. They began eating grass, tree bark, roots, and the carcasses of pack animals. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and typhus swept through the Japanese ranks, killing men faster than British bullets. Mutaguchi's divisional commanders begged him to call off the attack. The commander of the 33rd Division warned that his men were unfit for further combat. The commander of the 15th Division sent similar reports, but Mutaguchi refused to listen. He kept ordering his starving, disease-ridden troops to attack, again and again, insisting that one more push would break the British line. He fired his intelligence officers, ignored his staff, and quarreled with every subordinate who dared to question him. The gap between his fantasy and reality grew wider every day. Then Sato broke. On May 31st, 1944, Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato did something almost unheard of in the Imperial Japanese Army. He defied a direct order from his commanding officer. His 31st Division at Kohima was starving. His men were dying of disease faster than he could count them. No supplies had arrived. No reinforcements were coming. Mutaguchi ordered him to hold position and continue attacking. Sato looked at what was left of his division and said no. He cut his communication wires with 15th Army headquarters and ordered his surviving troops to retreat. When Mutaguchi's staff radioed to confirm that Sato was deliberately disobeying orders, Sato confirmed it without hesitation. In any other army, this would have been straightforward insubordination. In the Japanese military, where obedience to superiors was practically sacred, what Sato did was almost unimaginable. But his men were dying, and he could see that Mutaguchi was going to sacrifice every last one of them for a battle that was already lost. Rather than face court-martial, Sato was later declared mentally unfit, a convenient fiction that spared the army the embarrassment of admitting that one of its generals had been right to disobey. Sato's withdrawal from Kohima opened the road. On June 22, 1944, British forces from Kohima linked up with the defenders of Imphal, and the siege was broken. The Imphal-Kohima road was open again, but by this point, the road itself had become irrelevant in a sense, because the Japanese 15th Army was no longer capable of fighting. Mutaguchi was finally forced to call off the offensive on July 3rd, nearly 4 months after it began. What followed was one of the most horrifying retreats in the history of modern warfare. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers, starving, sick, and broken, stumbled back toward the Chindwin River through the same mountain jungle they had crossed with such confidence just months before. The monsoon was at its peak, and the mountain trails were flooded with rain. Men who could barely walk dragged themselves through knee-deep mud, supporting each other with sticks, collapsing beside the trail and never getting up again. Soldiers too sick to move were left behind with grenades so they could kill themselves rather than be captured. Some units were reduced to a fraction of their original strength. Sato's 31st Division, which had started the campaign with roughly 20,000 men, was down to perhaps 1,000 effective soldiers by the time the retreat began. The paths through the mountains became lined with corpses, so many that the retreating soldiers gave their escape route a name. They called it the Road of Bones. The Japanese lost over 53,000 men killed, wounded, or missing out of the 85,000 who had started the campaign. Many of the dead were never found, swallowed by the jungle, their bones scattered across mountain trails that no one would walk again. The Japanese abandoned virtually all of their artillery, their transport, their heavy equipment. They left behind an army that had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Meanwhile, British and Indian casualties at Imphal were around 12,500, with another 4,000 at Kohima. Heavy losses, but nothing compared to the catastrophe that had consumed the Japanese 15th Army. Mutaguchi responded to the disaster in the most predictable way possible. He blamed everyone except himself. He sacked all 3 of his divisional commanders, even though they had been the ones warning him for months that the operation was doomed. Then his superiors sacked him, relieving him of command in August 1944 and eventually forcing him into retirement. His boss, General Kawabe, who had approved the operation, was also removed after his health collapsed under the strain. The entire senior command structure of the Japanese army in Burma was gutted. After the war, Mutaguchi avoided prosecution for war crimes, but he never accepted responsibility for the disaster. He spent years claiming that the campaign would have succeeded if only Sato had obeyed orders and captured Dimapur. He even distributed a pamphlet denouncing Sato at Sato's own funeral in 1959. The grudge outlasted the war, the occupation, and everything that came after. On the British side, the victory at Imphal and Kohima transformed the war in Asia. The man who had engineered it, William Slim, led the 14th Army across the Chindwin River in late 1944, chasing the shattered Japanese back through Burma. Over the next year, the 14th Army fought its way 600 miles south, crossing the Irrawaddy River and capturing Mandalay and Meghtila before finally reaching Rangoon in May 1945. It was one of the most brilliant campaigns of the entire war. In December 1944, Slim and his senior commanders were knighted by the Viceroy of India in a ceremony at Imphal, the same town they had defended against the Japanese invasion just months before. But the victory at Imphal and Kohima was already being forgotten before the last shot was fired. On June 6, 1944, while British and Indian troops were still fighting for their lives in the mountains of northeast India, the Allied invasion of Normandy began. D-Day dominated every headline, every newsreel, every front page. The fighting in Burma, which had always struggled for press attention, vanished entirely from public consciousness. The soldiers of the 14th Army watched the news from Europe and saw that the world had once again forgotten them. That forgetting lasted for decades. In the years after the war, the battles of Imphal and Kohima received only a fraction of the recognition given to engagements like El Alamein, Stalingrad, or the D-Day landings. Books about the Burma campaign were scarce. Memorials were few. Veterans returned home to a public that barely knew they had been fighting at all. The 14th Army's nickname, the Forgotten Army, became less of a joke and more of a prophecy. And the Indian dimension of the battle was complicated too. India gained its independence in 1947, just 3 years after Imphal, and in the new India, Subhas Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army occupied a complex place in national memory. Bose was regarded by many as a patriot who had risked everything for Indian freedom, even though his alliance with Japan had placed him on the losing side at Imphal. During the campaign itself, INA soldiers had faced discrimination from their Japanese allies, denied proper rations and weapons, often assigned menial labor instead of combat roles. The grand alliance between the Indian National Army and the Japanese military was never the partnership of equals that Bose had envisioned. Bose himself died in a plane crash in Taiwan in August 1945, just days after Japan's surrender, and his death only added to the complicated legacy of the entire campaign. The British Indian soldiers who had fought to defend Imphal from the Japanese, and from Bose's Indian National Army alongside them, found themselves in an awkward position in the post-independence narrative. The battle did not fit neatly into any one country's story of the war. Yet what happened at Imphal and Kohima was massive. Military historian Robert Lyman has called it the battle that changed the course of the Second World War in Asia, arguing that the Japanese never recovered from the defeat. And in 2013, the British National Army Museum ran a public poll to determine what the nation considered its greatest battle ever. The shortlist included Waterloo, D-Day, and Agincourt. The winner, chosen after a public debate, was Imphal and Kohima. A battle that most people had never heard of was judged greater than the beaches of Normandy and the fields of Belgium. Think about that for a second. The battle that broke the Japanese army, the battle that opened the door to the liberation of an entire country, the battle that featured some of the most savage close-quarters combat of the 20th century on a tennis court in a remote Indian hill station. and the battle whose retreating army left so many dead along the jungle paths that the survivors named the trail after their bones. That is the battle that almost nobody remembers. Part of the reason is the terrain itself. Imphal and Kohima are remote even today, tucked into the mountainous northeast corner of India, far from the routes that most tourists or historians travel. The battlefields were swallowed back by the jungle within years. The fighting took place in a theater of war that the Western media had largely ignored during the conflict and continued to ignore afterward. It was not a battle fought by Americans, which meant Hollywood never told its story. It was not a battle fought primarily by white Europeans, which meant it occupied a smaller place in the historical narratives of the countries that won the war. But the men who fought there knew what they had done. The Kohima War Cemetery, built on the slopes of Garrison Hill where the tennis court battle took place, holds the graves of over 1,400 Allied soldiers. On its memorial stone is inscribed an epitaph that has become one of the most famous in military history. It was inspired by the ancient words written for the Spartans who died at Thermopylae, and it reads, "When you go home, tell them of us, and say, 'For your tomorrow, we gave our today.'" The men buried at Kohima and Imphal came from Britain, India, Nepal, West Africa, and East Africa. They fought in conditions that would have broken most armies, in heat and mud and monsoon rain, against an enemy willing to die rather than retreat. They won a battle that saved India from invasion, destroyed the Japanese army's offensive capability in Asia, and set the stage for the reconquest of an entire occupied country. And for most of the decades that followed, the world barely noticed. The Imphal campaign lasted from March to July 1944. In that time, over 200,000 men clashed in the hills and valleys of Manipur in what has been described as one of the greatest battles of the Second World War. A general's stubborn ego sent 85,000 men into mountains they could not be supplied in. A quiet, practical commander on the other side saw the trap and let them walk into it. And between those two decisions, tens of thousands of young men, Japanese, Indian, British, Gurkha, and African, paid the price in blood and bone along jungle trails that the world has long since stopped looking at. If this story made you want to learn more about the forgotten battles that shaped our world, drop a like, leave a comment, telling us which overlooked moment in history you think deserves more attention, and subscribe so you do not miss the next one.